Okay, let's get started with our first screencast of the semester. We're going to talk about secondary materials, and specifically I'm going to hopefully answer the question, why bother with them? Most students especially, and even some younger attorneys, want to dive right in for their case research, and I am hopefully going to convince you that much of the time, especially when you're new to an area of law, you want to start with secondary materials. Okay, so first let's define some terms. And again, this is going to be largely a review of what you did in legal writing, but let's make sure we're all on the same page. So defining those terms, what are secondary sources? Well, first let's start with what secondary sources are not, and of course they are not primary sources. I like to refer to primary sources as the law. Basically, what it is that we all have to abide by. And of course, the law, here as we can see the sources of the law, statutes, regulations, and of course, cases. We'll be going into a lot more depth about what these are and how to research them later on in the semester. Okay, so we know that secondary sources are not the law. So basically, secondary sources help us find and understand the law, and that's very important. So what kinds of secondary sources are there? Again, from first year, there are those encyclopedias. They cover a whole bunch of topics, abandoned property through zoning most likely, but cover them very briefly. You'll find some general jurisdiction encyclopedias, as well as you'll find several states, including New York, have state encyclopedias in New York called New York Jur. Restatements you've talked about in other classes. These are basic statements of the law put together by the American Law Institute, which is comprised of lots of experts in the field, including faculty in various law schools. American Law Reports, a little more difficult to understand, I think. Basically, they are a bit of a hybrid between an encyclopedia telling you what the law is and giving you citations to different states, statutes, and cases, but it goes into more depth. Each American Law Report, or sometimes article, will cover a particular topic. So with ALR, you're best off looking for one. If you find one close to your topic, you're golden, because again, it'll give you references to state and federal statutes and cases. But if you don't find one, don't spend too much time looking for it. Law reviews, you all of course know law reviews, articles written by mostly faculty, but experts in the field. Law reviews tend to be prescriptive in that they tell you what the author thinks the law should be, but what makes that so good is that in telling you what it should be, they tell you what it already is and gives you citations, references, as well as explanations to what the law currently is. And finally, treatises, and there are whole lots of different kinds of treatises. Treatise, by the way, is just a fancy word for a book, a title, on a particular subject written by an expert. Now, this book can be a single volume if we're talking in print, or it could be multi-volumes. And as I said, there are various different flavors of treatises. There are practitioner-oriented treatises that gives you lots of practice tips, and again, we'll be talking a lot about that later in the semester. There are loose leaves that pull together just about everything: primary material, explanations and secondary material, practitioner material. Again, we'll be looking at loose leaves in depth later on. Okay, so let's answer the question at hand. Why bother with secondary sources? Okay, we'll start with the short answer. And the main reason I want to start with this short answer is because it comes from a law firm librarian. This means this is somebody who is working with people, attorneys, who practice law. So hopefully her words will carry some weight with you. And her number 2 reason for the top 10 things law librarians wish new associates would know, her number 2 thing is to get some background on an issue before you sign in to Lexis or Westlaw, or these days Bloomberg. And she suggests some types of secondary sources we'll be talking about. She mentions encyclopedias. They'll give you, again, the background, some context, as well as assisting you in viewing the big picture. Okay, the longer answer and more detailed answer, which we've mentioned some already, it's going to give you references to the all-important law, those statutes, regulations, cases. It's going to help explain whatever you're looking at in English, in other words, in non-legalese. Remember promissory estoppel from contracts? Well, if you need a refresher on what that means, a secondary source is the place to go. It's going to identify potential issues. What if your particular issue involves a statute that requires a 3-part test? It's going to help you identify that, hey, there are these 3 different elements we have to be worrying about, so you can think about that moving forward in your research. It's going to identify terminology use. Promissory estoppel again. If you don't know to use the term promissory estoppel for that concept, you're going to have an awfully hard time researching it. Provide you with understanding how statutes, cases, and regulations interact. What if 2 cases seem to contradict each other? And also to keep you up to date on what's happening. Is there a current case that just got decided? Perhaps a state legislature is considering a change in the law. The law is changing every day. Secondary sources will help you keep up to date. When to use them? Again, the short answer, throughout the research process. More specifically, in the beginning, encyclopedia is going to help you to give you an introduction because it's pretty basic. You won't always just use encyclopedias at the beginning, and you won't always only use encyclopedias. Treatises sometimes will be great. Current awareness sources might be great. Again, it depends on your issue. Researching effectively is very issue specific, and you need to be very flexible on trying different resources to figure out what works best for your particular issue. In the middle, again, to help make sure that you found the important primary authority, treatises are particularly good. To follow up on any questions that you've learned, maybe those elements, you need more information and detail and to help understand what they are. And at the end, to make sure that you've got everything you need, again, that you are up to date on all the current issues. And again, current awareness sources can be good for that. And we will be talking about current awareness sources as well as treatises, encyclopedias, and ALR in subsequent classes. Okay, so hopefully I have convinced you secondary sources are frequently the place to start. How do you use them? Well, one place you might want to start is in an index. In the index, you would use the index if you have already know the specific term or the specific concept that you need to get more background on. So for instance, if you knew you were interested in the UCC, you might check one of these references if they were pertinent to your issue. Or what you might do, as the reference here says, is you might also turn the pages back in the index to S for sales contract and see what's listed under that heading. If you are interested instead perhaps in substituted agreement, then what you need to do, there's nothing here listed, you need to again flip back the pages in the index under D and check under discharge. And finally, my favorite, if you're interested in unconscionability, what this tells us is that there is a general discussion starting on page 380. I know it's page because it says it up here. Et sec 380 and following, which is why it's my favorite. That means not only am I getting a brief sentence or two reference to my concept, but I'm going to get several pages of reference. So when I see et sec, I know that that's a good thing. Let's move on to another source on how to use secondary sources, and that is the table of contents. Table of contents, in my opinion, is not appreciated nearly enough. Yes, it tells you what page you find the chapter on. We know that. But what it also does is give you the context of your subject. So here, again, we're looking at a contracts treatise, table of contents, and we're looking specifically at Chapter 9. And Chapter 9 talks about, as you can see, avoidance for mistake. But what we learn under Chapter 9 just from the table of contents is having to do with this idea of misconduct or mistake is the concept of duress. Also the concept of undue influence. And under undue influence, turns out there are elements of undue influence. So I am already learning terminology that I might use to research in the index or online. I'm also learning a little bit about this whole concept. There are elements in there, and what are some of the related ideas. So table of contents, great place to go if you're really not sure of what to look at in the index and you just want to get a sense of the topic. I can't tell you how many times I've flipped through a table of contents for 2 or 3 minutes and I've learned what terminology I need to use to research, and then I've gone online and done my research pretty easily. Okay, and of course there are keywords. We all like to go online, absolutely, and so here is how you would start to get a sense of looking at secondary sources online. So first let's look at Bloomberg Law, and what you might start doing is throw in a keyword search and then go down to your filters. And then you could find the filter for secondary source and take it from there. Works pretty much the same on Lexis. Do a keyword search, take a look at the filters here on the left-hand side, and sure enough, you see secondary materials, and same thing for Westlaw. And we'll be going over again in depth using these 3 sources to use secondary sources, to find secondary sources, as well as all the other materials we'll talk about this semester. Okay, you want to make sure to update, and update. You're going to hear a whole lot of that across the semester. The law is changing every day. It is critical for you to make sure that your research is up to date. Be very careful. You think online, oh, it must be up to date because it's online and it's so easy to up to date. Well, no, a website can go up in 2008 and never be updated. Even materials on Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg, if the underlying source wasn't updated for 3 years, then it's out of date. You need to be aware, again, that concept from last class of bibliographic awareness, one of our themes for the course. You need to be aware of how up to date your resource is, whether it's in print or online. And of course, you want to gather those primary references. After all, what you need to do is look at the law. Secondary sources are great, don't get me wrong, but ultimately you need to sit down and read the cases, read the statutes, read the regulations. So make sure that you keep track of what those useful ones are so you can go back to them. And speaking of keeping track, good idea is to keep a research log. I will show you how Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg can help you do that, but you want to keep track because inevitably you're going to get interrupted and not come back to a project for 2 weeks, and you don't want to have to start over from scratch. Be very, very careful when you're on Lexis and Westlaw. Secondary sources, as great as they are, can cost you major dollars. Now I say Lexis and Westlaw, I didn't say Bloomberg intentionally, and we'll talk about the pricing structures of all 3 services later on in the semester. But essentially, you are going to be conscious of what your contracts are with Lexis and Westlaw and find out what's involved in the contract and find out what's out of the contract. Many secondary sources are outside of the contract, and those are what can cost major, major dollars. Okay, so we've talked about what secondary sources are, why we want to use them, how to use them, what we might want to watch out for, how do we find them. Again, we'll be talking about this in the next few classes. You can see the list here, and we will talk about when each of these are useful. Just want to highlight something many may not know about. We'll talk about secondary sources on Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg, but there are also other legal databases out there that might be useful, and we'll talk about those as well. And we'll also talk about how to take advantage of the free web to find secondary sources and see what's out there on the free web in terms of secondary sources. Now, as I mentioned, not every secondary source is going to be great for every single issue, so you want to evaluate whatever it is you're using as you go. Obviously, is it helping you? Is it shedding light on the problem? If not, is it the secondary source, or did you possibly mischaracterize the problem, or do you have a different idea of what the problem is? An example is if you have a client who wants to get guidance because she is thinking about making a widget, but she hasn't made any yet, and she's wondering about how to market that widget, and you look into products liability questions, you're looking in the wrong spot because she hasn't made the product yet. There's nothing that she's liable for yet, so she's interested in the marketing end of it. As you research, do you need to change your preliminary questions any? Did you, as I said, possibly mischaracterize? Are there other issues? Are there additional questions? Again, the idea of the elements. Are there 3 elements that you now have to ask yourself each of those questions? Are there aspects of the law and complex areas of the law? Do you have to worry about some other aspect of jurisdiction that maybe you didn't know about earlier? Okay, that's it for secondary sources. The last thing I want to do is to highlight an article for you that talks not so much about secondary sources, but as you can see, what legal employers want to see in new graduates. And it does talk specifically about research on the pages mentioned here, but it really is a useful article just to get a sense of what employers are expecting from you when you graduate. So I highly recommend it. And last, just to remind you to be logged into TED-Ed and to answer the few questions. And that's it.